So welcome everyone to GCIC New York Climate Week event. The theme today is navigating the green revolution, technologies, policies, and financing for a successful energy transition. So for those unfamiliar with GCIC, Global Climate Innovation Coalition, we are a nonprofit organization promoting climate action by advancing innovative climate solutions and next generation development. Our programs aim to make this green transformation inclusive, accessible, and prosperous. And today, we are thrilled to have a diverse panel of experts with us. And let me introduce them. So Alex Campbell from London is at the forefront of the intersection between long-duration energy storage and policy initiatives and partnerships. He is the director of LDES Council. David Cavanagh from Perth, Australia, is an expert in hydrogen and renewable energy. He is the managing director of Integrated Energy and chief hydrogen officer of Hydrogen West and Hydrogen East Australia. And Dr. Alexander Heil, based in New York, has deep expertise in local and state government, policies and finances regarding energy transition and infrastructure. He's a senior economist at the conference. He's a senior economist at the Conference Board and adjunct faculty at both NYU and Columbia University. And finally, Professor Benjamin Hobbs leads systematic and interdisciplinary studies on energy transition, environmental systems, and health. He is chair professor of environmental management at Johns Hopkins University, global director at the NSF Electric Power Innovation and the Carbon Free Society Center, and also chairs the California ISO Market Surveillance Committee. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. And now without further ado, let's get started. So first, I would like to ask each of you to briefly explain your role in energy transition. What are the key progresses and developments are you seeing in your area, and what are the obstacles are you facing? So let's start from the technology side. We are all familiar with renewables like solar and wind, but storage is also critical to this transition. So Alex, can you tell us why long-duration energy storage is so crucial to making the electric grid sustainable, and what are the opportunities and challenges you see in terms of policy and partnerships?
Great, thank you so much, Ellen, and welcome everybody. So just a little bit about the Long Duration Energy Storage Council. We're a globally focused industry association. We have around 60 members, including technology startups, all the way through to some of the biggest users and operators of energy in the world. So what is long duration energy storage, or LDES for short? So we define that as the ability to discharge energy, stored energy, continuously for 8 hours or more. And that's important because obviously we have shorter duration storage technologies like lithium-ion, which many people will be familiar with, the batteries, which are also in electric vehicles and phones and so on. But we really need some of the longer duration storage technologies as well. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a moment. Just again, for a little bit more of the technology context, we have 4 what we call families of LDES. So this is things like mechanical forms of storage. So pump storage hydropower, where you pump water up a hill when electricity is cheap and then release it when electricity is expensive or demand is high. Compressed air and other forms of mechanical storage. Electrochemical, so batteries that people will be very familiar with, and there's a wide range of chemistries, not just lithium-ion, but all sorts of exotic other chemistries as well, which have slightly different use cases and abilities and services they can provide. Thermal forms of storage, really, really important, and I'll talk about that again in a moment. So taking renewably generated electricity, storing it in the form of heat, and this can be in sand, in bricks, in crushed rocks, and then reused as dispatchable firm heat. And then last but by no means least, chemical forms of storage, and this will be things like hydrogen, where you store energy in the form of chemical bonds. Now, Why are all these technologies so important? So as I'm sure many of you know, the world's electricity system is fundamentally changing. We're going from a world which is predominantly dominated by gas and coal, which we have to stop using in order to tackle climate change. So we're going to see huge amounts of wind and solar coming onto grids. In order to get to net zero, organizations like the International Energy Agency, the IEA, and the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, they forecast something like 23, 24 terawatts of wind and solar. And to put that in context, in 2020, there was less than 8 terawatts of all forms of electricity generation on grids worldwide. So we're moving to these variable sources of electricity as our predominant source of electricity. Obviously, the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. We have to be able to store this energy to be able to use it and dispatch it when people need it. And I'll just finish up with one more other brief comment. That's electricity, really, really important. We decarbonize electricity, but heat is actually a major source of carbon emissions globally as well. Huge volumes of heat, something like 50% of energy end use is for heat, around 40% of energy related carbon emissions come from heat. So industrial processes are a really important part of that. And if we take renewably generated electricity, store it in the form of heat storage, and then dispatch that to industrial end users, whether it's in the chemicals industry, food and drinks, wide range of uses, we can really help to decarbonize quickly. So lots of technologies out there, not being built at the scale we need. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that a bit more. We've got some really strong policy recommendations to enable that around long-term revenue visibility, around grid connection fees, all things that need to happen. But yeah, hopefully that's an overview of the technologies that our sector represents and a really critical part of the energy transition. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Alex. And David, let's talk about Australia and hydrogen. We know how Australia is positioning itself as a future hydrogen superpower, and hydrogen can also be considered a way to store renewable energy. So can you tell us more about the progress in Australia and globally?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's nice to be giving a bit of a Southern Hemisphere perspective as well in this space. So we've seen significant progress in hydrogen in the last year. In Australia, it's been a fundamental underpinning of a program towards a future made in Australia, where it's a couple of $1 billion to underpin the long-term growth of hydrogen in various roles in Australia. They vary from heavy-duty long-distance transportation, which has been identified for a long time, through to core element of things like green steel for export, where we're embedding the hydrogen into products for export rather than exporting the hydrogen directly. We have some really innovative local technology, which is also being exported now, where we generate the hydrogen exactly where it's needed. We heard about some of the challenges of storage. And the opposite way to go is just produce the hydrogen exactly when and where you need it. Don't store it at all, just use it as you make it on demand. And I'm actually calling you from a very remote island in the northwest of Australia, a very beautiful area called the Kimberleys, about as diametrically opposed from New York as you could imagine. Yeah. And when we're all billionaires, we'll go in our super yachts and cruise around the beautiful wilderness of the Kimberleys. Right in the middle of that, there's a beautiful island which has been a mine for 60 years. And Queen Elizabeth came on a coronation, and then 50 years later. And we're helping the company there, Mount Gibson, transition from being reliant on diesel for their fuel and for their energy to now providing a solution which uses hydrogen to displace some of that diesel, both in a generation mode and in transportation mode. And today we actually produced our very first hydrogen today as we speak. So it's a nice day for that. And also the first use in a generator. So yes. And the nice thing about these micro applications is the really quick payback. So this is really economic, like 1 year payback. So any community in the world that's burning diesel or petrol for power or transport, we believe there's a really viable first step And with the money they save, they've got then money to spend on solar and batteries and the next steps down the renewable chain. So for me, that's a real message of hope. And we've my company, Integrated Energy, we work around the world in 20 countries, clients like the United Nations, World Trade Organization, federal government in Australia, state governments, regional governments, and many of the large energy companies that you know, and mining companies that you know globally have been our clients. But I'm really encouraged by this type of project because it can apply in so many communities around the world. And that's one of the significant opportunities. And the challenges along the way, safety is so important to us. My company's run for 15 years without a lost time injury. And we know the effort it takes to be systematically safe in our deployment. So safety and education and building capability are important parts of successful deployment, as well as the policies and underpinning standards which enable that. So we've been part of the national and international standards for hydrogen for about 6 years now. And in particular, helping the World Trade Organization think about the trade in hydrogen, hydrogen-related technology, hydrogen-related skills, and underpinning finance mechanisms for hydrogen. And I'm really pleased with the way they picked up on those ideas. And as recently as the last COP, where I helped represent Australia, they were promoting, here's a trade toolkit for hydrogen. So that's an important, I would say, trade initiative. So we have very large scale mining trucks now running on hydrogen here in Australia, noticeably Fortescue, and we have hydrogen products like ammonia. Again, in Northwest Australia, we just offloaded a bunker transfer of ammonia fuel for marine application. So the uses of hydrogen are diversifying, and I'm really quite encouraged, actually. You hear different ups and downs in the hydrogen cycle, but it's great when we're delivering projects which we know give great sustainability benefits and great economic benefits at the same time. Maybe that's enough to open the conversation with others. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's a great big picture of the hydrogen. And now let's talk with Dr. Heil. And could you share how local and state government policies and finances can support and driving this transition, and what obstacles you encounter to drive this effective funding and decision making?
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. So just to give a little context, so I'm currently a senior economist at the Conference Board. Conference Board is a think tank essentially that is focused on member organizations. Those member organizations are, Fortune 500 corporations. So the work that I put out is really looking at various types of energy analysis of different decarbonization pathways, looking at climate and really taking it all together, all the way from, I really welcome this conversation about storage and hydrogen and all these issues we're going to talk about. They're also critical. And just trying to translate what this means for business leaders in terms of their decision making. Because that's really, that's sort of my perspective, and what we have certainly, tried to communicate now for years is that it was always the case that, renewables, if you incorporate all the costs, all social costs from an economist point of view, they've always been advantageous, but now they're coming to the point where they're actually the lowest cost, right? Depending on where you look in the world, solar might actually be the cheapest form of generating electricity. And so now the challenges are scalability. Now the challenges are to combine that with aforementioned storage, because you do have these problems in some, with a US-centric lens. States like California have actually done quite well incorporating some storage into their grid mix, and that's allowed for the greater utilization of storage. But the other work that we do, and this goes more to the question in terms of, government involvement, is also about, so scalability also depends on, interconnection, depends on permitting, depends on what's the rate at which some of these sites can actually be rolled out. And especially in the US, this has been a real bottleneck. So it's been a real problem in terms of, if you look at the interconnection queue, there's a fair bit of everything in the interconnection queue. It certainly leans much more heavily towards renewables. So if you're saying that you can speed this up, you're going to bring actually many more, renewable resources into the grid mix, which we'll need to do. We need to expand from the current 20% that we have in renewables when we come to power generation. But let me also just make a related point, which is more sort of specific. Prior to being at the conference board, I was the chief economist at the Port Authority here in New York, so like multimodal transportation agency. So I'm really a transportation kind of a guy. And if we take, let's say, wind, in particular offshore wind, which has received a lot of focus in the northeast of the US, and there's a lot of debate now around, some of the respective impacts. But there's a huge issue around the supply chain, and local governments in particular play a huge role in making sure that some of these massive infrastructure projects can actually be constructed and then operated, not just in the construction, but also in the maintenance phase later on. And there's a lot of competition for port space. It is very hard to have more port space available, especially with container vessels becoming larger, more and more containers. There's more peaking, there's more demand for that space. Some of the wharves are so old that they may not withstand the weight of some of the wind turbine equipment. So there's real need for local governments to play an important role, not just, just looking at their own, let's say, state level climate and decarbonization performance, but also what this means from just getting projects built and operated. So as I was saying before, the permitting and sort of the administrative process is one, but then also having the sites available where this can happen. And there's lots going on, but I think it will come down to more collaboration on the state and local level, in particular in the US, and that applies to certainly other parts of the world as well. It's not the same, government structure, certainly, but I think thinking about this as isolated resources that benefit one small part of the country or a country itself, it's not always helpful. You really need to look at this from a broader perspective of saying, well, how can we build all this infrastructure that is critical for these decarbonization pathways? So let me stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Heil. Thank you. Then let's move on to Professor Hobbs. So please provide us a broader systematic view of these challenges. And maybe you could also touch on your project, like how AI assists with the power grids and how this emerging energy transition might impact our environment and health. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ellen, for inviting me to join. And I would like to share a couple slides and tell you about two new global consortia that are attempting to help power system operators facilitate the transition by keeping rates down, keeping the system reliable, and finally getting to our net zero targets using the hydrogen, wind, and storage technologies that the two Alexes and David have discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So the first of these consortia is the Global Power Transition Consortium, which is being led by 6 system operators that are located, well, in the 3 countries represented here, the UK, the United States and Australia, as well as Denmark and Ireland. These are all system operators that have at times a majority of their infeed, their power from renewable resources, and at all times a very large fraction of it, which is where we're all headed eventually. This consortia has the following goals, which is to scale the transition on a global basis and enabling all power system operators reliably, economically, and sustainably operate their systems. This is crucial because the staff of those operators have been trained in the power systems of Nikola Tesla, that is heavy rotating machinery to maintain stability, and the inverter-based resources, storage, batteries, wind, and solar, operate on very different principles that actually provide a number of challenges to system stability, challenges that we will be able to manage, but we need research and we need staff trained to deal with those. This consortium is also promoting collaborative research and the development of tools needed to manage inverter-based resources, not just by operators worldwide, but also vendors and academics. And finally, training the next generation, and especially increasing the diversity of that workforce is very important. The other consortium, which works very closely with GPST on the research side, is the center that I direct, Electric Power Innovation for Carbon-Free Society, that I direct together with Imperial College, Mark O'Malley, and the University of Melbourne. We have participants from not just our 3 countries, but others worldwide, and we address 4 challenges. One is the AI challenge, Ellen, that you mentioned, dealing with big data. So the AI challenge in people's nightmares will make achieving sustainability a lot more difficult because of the power requirements of data centers. But on the other extreme, there are highly optimistic people who think that we can lower the costs by 25%, 50% even, of achieving the transition. And we're doing research to try to be more towards the optimistic end than the pessimistic end. We have to deal with the power needs of data centers, which is a huge challenge, but there's a lot that AI can do. Second, there's the modeling and integration inverter-based resources, which, as I mentioned, present stability challenges, the so-called wobble, for example, in voltage frequencies, subsynchronous variations in voltage that cause the traffic lights in Glasgow to blink, and so forth. These are challenges that we need to understand the physics and then have the tools to deal with them, and we certainly will. We had similar challenges with large synchronous machines and long power lines in the 60s, and we'll deal with this one, but we need to do research and develop tools. Third, new economic principles for power markets for coordinating long-term investment as well as short-term operations, making sure they flange up in a sensible way so that what's socially beneficial from the reliability, economic, and sustainable point of view is also economic to invest in and economic to operate, and it all fits together. And finally, the pathways for net zero transition, as David emphasized, decarbonization is more than just electricity. There's heat, there are industrial processes such as cement production, there's transportation, all of which could benefit from a decarbonized electric sector. And so we are also doing work on multi-fuel integration of hydrogen, electricity, and other fuels. So thanks again, Ellen, for inviting me.
Thank you, Professor Hobbs. Before we move to the next section, so for all the audience here, if you have any questions, please tap into the Q&A box below, and we will answer them at the end of the panel. So now let's move on to some broader discussion points. I have prepared a few topics to explore. The first one is scaling. Everyone in energy is talking about scaling. Without it, we won't achieve our goals. It is also the most significant challenge across all sectors of the energy transition. So what kind of progress and problems are you seeing in your fields? Yeah, anyone can jump in.
Can I kick off? I'm happy to have a go first. Thank you. So from our sector's perspective, with long duration energy storage, we have some technologies which are very much deployed at scale today, and that is particularly pumped storage hydropower, which is a fantastic technology, but it's quite geographically constrained. So you can't just build pump storage anywhere. You need the right sort of geography for it. For our other technologies, we've got a number of challenges. First of all, there's the diversity. So, often investors or governments will say to me and my colleagues, which technology should we pick? And it's, well, it really depends on what your use case is. Do you need 8 hours? Do you need 24-hour duration? These types of challenges. So to get the technologies built at scale and bring the costs down, we really need public and private partnerships. So we need governments to set targets, to send signals to investors and the supply chain, and then we need mechanisms which really financial mechanisms which can unlock the deployment. And it's difficult. I used to work in the UK Energy Department. Government's not there to sign blank checks for industry. They want to know that they're going to unlock deployment that's going to have a long-term benefit, and it can be a challenge. And what we've seen with mechanisms, for example, in offshore wind, we saw governments in Northwest Europe in particular setting targets, but then introducing revenue mechanisms, which over time help to bring down costs and really ramp up deployment, work very successfully. Concepts like the contracts for difference, for example, in the North Sea. So I think for me to really start to deploy our suite of technologies, which is just one part of the energy transition and one part of the solution, it's about governments setting strong targets and then providing long-term financial signals to the market, and then for industry to respond, work out how to build these things well, and then to bring down costs so that consumers and citizens can benefit.
Lovely. And anyone want to add anything on the scale?
Yeah, can I just on the scale issue, and this ties with the other Alex apparently just mentioned in terms of financial signals. I think financial signals are critical, and it's interesting to just note the system that especially the Inflation Reduction Act has introduced in the United States in broad strokes is a system of subsidies, and that's great, and that's actually been quite successful, as early data suggests, in terms of what this actually has sort of empowered the energy sector to do. I think there's sort of, and maybe there's a bias as the economist in me speaking, you have to really price some of the social cost. And I think if with appropriate pricing, and so other parts of the world have been much more, much more aggressive, much more forward thinking about this compared to the US. Carbon taxes, pricing, mechanisms like that can play a critical role in really getting on this push towards scale. I think that's really important. It is not just a question of providing financing as part of it, but it's also a question of having the appropriate comparison between different energy types. So that rationality can actually take over and say, oh yeah, solar, wind, in certain applications, hydrogen, storage, all of this is actually advantageous from a cost perspective as well.
Strongly support that. It's a really important point. Sorry.
Yeah, I might chip in some of our experiences in the hydrogen space, which expand across renewables more generally. And typically the challenge when introducing a new type of energy, a new type of product like that, is the need to, at the same time, develop both the supply and the demand side of the equation so that projects are bankable, reach FID, and build out successfully. And the classic chicken and egg of hydrogen infrastructure for transportation versus the availability of vehicles, availability of the hydrogen, availability of the stations, all happening at the same time, which does require a certain amount of integrated planning, part of my background. And we've seen, good examples happening now in Europe, in places like Germany, Korea, somewhat in Japan and California, I think now on a new wave with the heavy duty transportation infrastructure. So that's one area. And I guess the timeliness of connection and development of large-scale infrastructure tie-ins, which enable some of these big projects, things like electrical infrastructure and ports, that where the timeline is not necessarily in the control of any particular project, it's more at a governmental level. So that's an area where project schedules can shift and things not need to develop as quickly as some people would like. So that's kind of a couple of areas of challenge, but nonetheless, we've been seeing very significant breakthroughs in hydrogen production technologies and storage technologies and end use too. So, which are significantly bringing down the capital intensity of the hydrogen ecosystem, and with the appropriate long-term market signals, I believe it makes it a better economic alternative than continuing with diesel use, for example, particularly when we consider the environmental and health and social factors as well, which again in California was a good example of integrating health considerations with economic and environmental considerations. So there's a couple of perspectives from hydrogen in Australia, mainly.
Thank you, David.
So I'll jump in. Thanks, Ellen, for asking about scaling up and maybe some of the challenges. And since David is talking about California, I'll mention one challenge there, and then a broader challenge that's just becoming evident in the United States. So a challenge in California, it's the flip side of the coin that battery storage is being very successful. We have 10 gigawatts now of batteries in a system with a peak load of about 45 gigawatts, and that will be 14 gigawatts by Christmas. There's another 4 gigawatts coming in our Christmas stocking, and that will double perhaps in the next 3 years. So the challenge is the rapidity of this scaling, in that the market, which I chair the Market Surveillance Committee for the state. The market was designed for dispatchable rotating machines that could be dispatched on a 5-minute to 5-minute basis. And as you know, we had the Enron crisis 20-odd years ago, when they learned how to game the system. So we put in safeguards against large power plants gaming the system. But now we have, with 28 or so gigawatts of storage that will soon be online, the opportunity to exercise local market power, because many of these battery installations are on the order of a gigawatt in size. So many batteries. And they can manipulate local transmission constraints. And our market power mitigation mechanisms, our optimization methods were all based on this 5-minute or hour-by-hour dispatchable units, and weren't based on a system in which a battery's opportunity cost will depend on price expectations for many hours in the future, or with long duration storage, perhaps many days in the future. And so we're vulnerable to market power. We're definitely have inefficient operations because our time horizons are too short, and we don't see the value of storage beyond that time horizon. We will need to adapt these markets, and other markets will need to do the same as this wave of storage crashes over them. Challenge number 2 is just becoming evident now, that the rate at which new renewable clean sources are being introduced is actually overwhelming. Well, as has already been mentioned by Alex, has been overwhelming our interconnection processes, and has also been using up the best sites, at least for example, in terms of land-based wind in the eastern United States, and is running into great difficulties in terms of developing offshore resources as well. And this is being manifested in interesting ways. All of a sudden, this last year, load-serving entities in Maryland, my state, have not been able to buy renewable energy credits or get purchase power agreements for about half of their obligations under the law. And this is in large measure because the Amazons and Microsofts and Metas, all of whom want to run their data centers with clean power, are hoovering up, vacuuming up all the renewable energy credits they can. And as a result, there are shortages because basically on the supply side, you cannot develop, we are not developing renewable energy resources fast enough to meet the demand of both industry and renewable portfolio standards. Now, so the market is reflecting this in a very high price of renewable energy credits. And of course, this is the market working. This is what markets do. There's scarcity, it sends a high price, and we hope that it will respond. But it does indicate that there are supply chain difficulties, not just in the ports for offshore wind, but in all areas of renewable energy development that need to be faced. And the symptoms are suddenly becoming apparent in higher capacity costs, higher energy costs in the West, and sky-high renewable energy credits. These are growing pains that we will overcome, and I think we will do a better job of overcoming them with appropriate market mechanisms. But they need our attention now.
Great.
Thanks for the link.
Great remarks from Professor Hobbs. And now let's talk about, well, that's a topic. It's a 1.5 climate goal. So many experts believe we are on the track to miss the target already. And we are expecting more extreme weathers become more frequent. And what should we think ahead in this energy transition in a proactive way to ensure this transition and the system we're building are resilient?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off on that one if you like. So I did some work for the United Nations Environmental Sustainability Group focused in Asia Pacific, looking at the opportunity for renewables and hydrogen. And what I did was I plotted in on the famous plots of 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees and so on, global climate change based on the CO2. I plotted in a couple of points, and these points came from particular case studies which we know really well, like the island I'm on now, and also a regional government in the southwest of Western Australia, where we did some feasibility study for them on how they could supply their needs for power and for transport in alternative ways to what they currently had. And this involved both a combination of solar, battery storage, and hydrogen for vehicles. And then we looked at different scales that those might be produced and used across their community with the associated growth in jobs and so on. And in both these cases, the economic payback is, in the case of where I am now, under 2 years was the screening threshold, which is pretty quick payback. And certainly within 4. And for the regional government, it was again, around 3 to 5 years. And these opportunities led to significant decarbonisation, like more than 50% decarbonisation. So from our ground up work, for me, that was a message of opportunity that says there is in fact an economic solution for at least those 2 cases and probably many others, which enables us to decarbonise more quickly than is required for 1.5 degree Celsius global temperature rise. And furthermore, it told me that the companies and the communities which acted quickly in that direction would not only have a better environmental outcome, but also a better economic one. So those are the companies and communities which would thrive into the future. It's a little bit different, a little bit more optimistic, perhaps, than just projecting different curves at different rates, as large oil companies and energy companies are good at doing, and many other groups. This was more like coming from a bottom-up analysis of a couple of cases. And I think it's a message for hope, and it's a message for action too. So that's my personal perspective to start the ball rolling on that one.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the personal and the note of optimism. I always, it's a Friday morning here in New York, so I've rolled out of bed a little bit more pessimistically, I think. So I look at the world as, and I sort of go back and forth. I will promise I'll end with a more optimistic note. But if I just look at the right, emissions are still rising. So it's hard for me to just look at this as a pathway that is going to allow the world to stay, close to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in general. That seems really hard to put together as a sort of, if I just want to solve for that equation. And I look at the US as the example. The US is down in emission, 17% or so since 2005. That's largely an energy sector story, sort of movement away from coal towards gas. There is much greater efficiencies. Some of the early moves into computing power have not resulted in massive increases in demand for electricity. That may now change with AI. I think we have sort of seen, renewables are taking up 20%. But there is, industrial, residential, commercial uses, they haven't really fallen when it comes to the carbon emissions. So I look forward and I project, it's, and again, the lens through which I look is then, let's say, okay, transportation in the US, adoption of electric vehicles is growing rapidly, but it's going much slower than in, let's say, China, other parts of the world. It will take a real effort and some real sort of breakthroughs to get this to work, and certainly behavioral changes. And it's not just in people's individual backyards, but certainly government policy as well to support this move. Without that, it's hard to see that we're going to get there. However, I promise the optimistic endpoint. So then I have my students, and they're very much focused on working in this field. They're very much focused on doing something meaningful about climate change and decarbonization. And they're coming up with incredible ideas and have an incredible drive, starting companies to produce products that will really revolutionize certain markets in some parts of the world. And, whenever I need a note of more optimistic thinking, that's where I usually look for the next generation. But I think it's also unfortunately true that the next generation that is now coming into the workplace or just recently, entered, they're going to have a lot of obstacles to deal with on this path.
If I could just jump in on that kind of positive note and echoing some of the points there, I think it's clear we do have the technology options to keep to 1.5 degrees. It is physically possible. It is financially possible, but there are substantive challenges to getting there. And I'm also slightly downbeat thinking, is it realistically going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years? Possibly not, but we do have the technologies there to enable it. So maybe when this next generation comes through, they will get us back down again, but we're going to have a slightly unpleasant period beforehand. But just on the particular point on resilience and grids, if we don't get to 1.5 degrees, if we overshoot, and we do need to make sure that our energy systems are indeed resilient to tackle with the increased climate events. And there are, again, a suite of technologies that can help with that, including storage technologies, to enable more remote areas to keep power going for 3 days plus. We've seen lots of resilience can be built in other ways with grid flexibility, with interconnections between different grids around the world. So there are lots of options available. Let's just hope we can actually get there before it's too late.
Professor Hobbs, I think you're mute yourself. Can you open your?
I think the microphone detected that I was going to be a little bit pessimistic, and so it muted me. I think it's more likely than not we're going to blow right through the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. I mean, that's very sad, and that if the consequences of doing so are anything like what we're getting hints of now, this is truly a disaster which will get worse, which implies that we do need to be thinking of in tandem with lowering emissions and mitigation and climate adaptation, we need to be thinking about geoengineering. And there are technologies that there's some evidence, but we don't know. We have to try them out, that can increase the albedo reflectivity of the Earth without significant ecologic impacts, but they need to be tested. And if you opened your New York Times this morning, at least the other resident Alex in New York, when you got up this morning, you'll see a very large article about the new resistance to geoengineering, which is from the same folks who have brought you opposition to vaccines. And so there's going to be not only environmental concerns from and skepticism from the normal environmental quarters, skepticism that is of course deserved, because you have to test these things and be sure that they will work. But we're also going to get political pushback from perhaps unexpected quarters that are going to make that difficult too. And if it turns out that we need to do that, there's going to be scientific and engineering and economic obstacles, and there will be political obstacles as well.
Thank you. I love this mix of the optimistic and the pessimistics. That's perfect. And finally, I have one last topic that I prepared. So I hope everyone can have a short comments on this. It's about the next generation development. So, I mean, this is a long transform, gonna take decades to happen. And 1/3 of the global population are youth. So what advice would you give to next generation who want to prepare themselves to be part of this field, and especially in this evolving and uncertain field with all kinds of pessimistic challenge questions out there? So yeah,
I'm happy to lead into that one if you like. So here in Western Australia, I developed a small curriculum for high school students, and I've had the joy of personally delivering some of that to 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old children, including at my daughter's school, and a number of others. And we make it very interactive with virtual reality, with hydrogen cars driving, with wind turbines spinning, with solar panels generating, and what we find is great interest and determination from those children. And I think it's also gives them some exposure at an early enough age that it influences perhaps some of their choices for the subjects they're going to take. Maybe they'll keep more with some science and technology and maths to make that opportunity available to them in their future. I think it's critical to give them that awareness, to give them those opportunities. And it's a lot of it's for the next generation, and most of us have children and feel it pretty personally. So that's maybe a starting point. But we also do education on behalf of the government here at different levels of seniority. But I think that engagement, with the teenagers and earlier is pretty important.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think this, and I think this also there needs to be balanced with a certain, and we're coming back to this notion of optimism, or rather pessimism, around the climate crisis, right? So there's a lot of, one can just sort of throw in the towel and say, oh, we're not going to make it, and that's going to get adopted by the next generation coming in, and everybody's just, it sort of turns into paralysis of not being fully invested, because it's hard to see how you can change the outcome. But I think it's important to also communicate that, this is not a black and white kind of an, future scenario, but this is a very much gray zone. So, tenth of degrees make a difference in the projection if we're going on the path to 2100. There's a big difference, overshooting 1.5 or 2 degrees. The degree to which you're overshooting will matter in the outcomes. And this is not going to be an equitable outcome at the end of the day, because, rich countries have much more in terms of resources to shield themselves against some of the worst effects. And, this also then, even within countries, is certainly true if we're looking at different income groups. So there's a real equity issue. I think coming back to sort of the youth, I think there's, on the one hand, I always try to communicate that there is you have to work on this problem and do this in a sort of positive spirit, because if you just completely are fatalistic about it, that's not going to help. And then what I hope the next generation also does is think about this in terms of creative solution. And I have all these the storage experts here in this call, and I really, I'm sort of out of my depth, but when I talk, for instance, about electric vehicles, I, bring up the issue of bidirectional charging, where you basically have, if you have hundreds of millions of cars on the road, they are mostly unused because they're cars are not used 90% of the time, but they have batteries in a combined form that provides a lot of capacity that could be added to the grid to balance out fluctuations. So I think thinking about some of those solutions and paths that are maybe non-traditional and a sort of unique new way of thinking is also something that should be encouraged in this process. It's not just the old stuff. Some of the old stuff really hasn't worked well, as we can tell. So it's now thinking about new solution that is probably helpful.
If I could just quickly add to that point, I can't remember if it was Alex or Professor Hobbs who mentioned earlier with grid operators, system operators having quite conventional old school ways of thinking. And I think that is the great benefit of bringing through a new generation, actually, is they don't default to the established ways of thinking. And when we need to make fundamental changes, let's hope the next generation coming through don't resort to the old ways of thinking, which sometimes have got, I'm not saying chuck out all of the old, obviously some of the basic principles that are important, but that type of innovation and expecting the change, whether it's vehicle to grid charging, whether it's different ways of thinking about resilience, it's critically important. And it does give me a bit more optimism than the bare facts of the numbers at the moment around carbon emissions perhaps would point to.
No. I know we're getting near time, so I'll be quick. But Ellen, your question about what do we need to do in education, that resonates with a question in the chat box from Ira Song about what lessons can be learned from countries that have already successfully integrated renewable energy into their grids, and how can they be applied globally. So those of you who remember the first integration studies of 10 or 15 years ago, the questions were, can we handle 20% renewables without the grids collapsing? And it's, of course, clear that you see occasions when, for example, Denmark is running on 100% local renewables. Now, some stability services are being provided from Germany and Norway, so they're it's not a standalone system, but it can, clearly there have been successes, and we've been able to do, with clever engineering and with markets, be able to do much better in integrating renewables than people thought. And those lessons need to be conveyed to the rest of the world from the system operators who are already dealing with 30, 40, 50% inverter-based resources, heading towards 80, 90, and perhaps hopefully 100%, that those lessons can be conveyed to the rest of the world. not only through the universities and university programs, STEM, science and engineering type programs, but also through business schools and government schools, and then especially through outreach and extension to practitioners, to people who are already in the control rooms, who are seeing this wave of renewables and batteries coming in and are trying to deal with it, that we need continuing education as well. And as I mentioned, that is the goal of the Global Power Systems Transformation Consortium, which cannot do that all by itself, but it's that together with governments, what the U.S. Department of Energy, the Agency for International Development is doing, for example, that will help transfer the information that's needed based on experience with real systems and managing this to systems all around the world who will be undergoing the same transition a little bit later.
Thank you, Professor Hobbs. I think we're a little bit behind the schedule, so I will be quick on the Q&A session. Now open to the floor of the questions. We have great questions here. So I think this one is for Dr. Heil. So could you please elaborate on more successful specific example of PPPs or other creative ways cities are financing and incentivizing their energy transition? Let's put things in short.
Yeah, so I mean, like I mentioned before, in terms of my background, I'm currently sort of outside of the this direct world of government finance, certainly. But just to make a general point, triple Ps, private-public partnerships, are certainly critical, as is a lot of different financing strategies. I think we're at the point where there's different types of energy resources. They all need to be brought to market. All the barriers and obstacles need to be overcome. And certainly having government play an important role in providing some of the funding, optimizing some of the resources so that you can leverage up and you can actually increase the pie that is available for financing is critical. So, just to, as is the case for infrastructure in general, I think one should probably think about this in terms of, well, optimizing the system, creating efficiencies and greater capacity will probably require different types of funding mechanisms, and triple Ps are one of them.
Thank you, Dr. Heil. And one more question, I think that's for all. It's a great question about the energy poverty. So do you think do you think the developing regions tend to rely more on the traditional energy resources like solid fuels, coal? How can the energy transition avoid exacerbating the inequality? I think that's for everyone.
Okay, I have a quick go. So it's a huge question and a really important one, which I don't think we'll be able to answer in a couple of minutes. But yes, sub-Saharan Africa, there are still hundreds of millions of people who don't have access to electricity. The energy transition provides us with an opportunity actually to get power to those people and bypass fossil fuels, most obviously with solar. And we haven't really talked about, we talked about some of the negativity. The cost of solar has come down so much in recent years that this is a massive, massive success story for the world. And that can really, really help bring people out of energy poverty, like I say, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. I saw a crazy stat the other day. There's more solar panels, I think it's in Denmark or Belgium, than there is in Africa, which just it blows my mind. It's ridiculous. So we can deploy these types of technology, obviously with things like storage, because at night you still want to have electricity. But there's a huge amount to unpack there. But I am reasonably positive with the right investment, the technology is there. It can be deployed, and it should be. There is a moral imperative to do so.
Yeah, I'm happy to build on that, and I would say one of the most encouraging things of some of the technology working with now is it's deployable to any community that is currently spending money on diesel or petrol, and they can save money rapidly, which will then enable them to buy their solar panels because of the money they didn't spend on petrol or diesel, and really spread that spread that benefit. And I spoke at a Africa Australia conference a couple of weeks ago, and Kenya is already up towards 80% renewables. So the message is getting out there, yeah, I think that's a message of opportunity, and indeed an imperative in many ways.
I just would quickly point out it's not just poverty, but it's also health, in that the combustion of solid fuels, whether charcoal or dried animal waste, is the cause of severe asthma and other health problems. And so electricity can certainly help with that as well.
Yes, this is a huge question. I think we're running out of time, and we definitely cannot take humanitarian out of the equation when we're talking about the transition. And thank you for all the great questions and the great answers. And thank you so much for being with GCIC today. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thanks, everybody in the audience. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you guys.